So hello, I'm Christian Stevenson with Mississippi State University Extension Service in Hancock County. Today I am going to be talking to you about planting trees in the home landscape. And we're going to talk not only about the actual process of planting an individual tree, but also a little about selection of plants and care of plants after we have gotten them in the ground. So I'd like to start off with an understanding of why we're doing the thing that we're doing. And trees provide a lot of services to us in our home landscape. They can provide food and shelter for wildlife, so the birds and other animals that we enjoy having there in our landscape have that place and have those resources. They're going to protect our soil, prevent soil erosion, protect our streams and rivers if you have bodies of water on your landscape. They are beautiful. Having those trees there in the landscape is just something that's enjoyable to look at. They also provide shade. They protect us from high winds. They can serve as a barrier for noise, or if you have an area you don't want to look at, having a tree there can block that off and just beautify your landscape again. And of course, people do also plant trees as a celebration of Arbor Day or tree planting weeks, as well as memorials. So trees do a lot of work for us in the landscape. And so we want to make sure that we do a good job taking care of them. And I want to start with that by talking about where we want to get our trees. There are a lot of options out there. And with more modern technology, a lot of us are moving to buying things online. And it is perfectly possible to order trees from an online nursery. But there's some things that we want to think about when we're considering where we buy our trees. And I am a big proponent of shopping local in every way that we can possibly manage. And I certainly think that buying trees is an opportunity to shop local. So make sure you check your local nurseries, check your local garden centers first to see if you can go ahead and buy that plant right there in your community. Generally speaking, for the money that you're going to spend on that plant, you're going to get a lot bigger tree shopping local than you will, getting it sent to you from somewhere else. You're not having to worry about shipping costs and other things like that. So you're going to wind up with a bigger tree for the same amount of money. Another really important thing there is our nursery managers are as a rule very knowledgeable about the plants that they grow and the plants that they sell. So you're going to be able to interact with someone that's knowledgeable about the specific tree that you're interested in planting. They can answer questions for you, like, what sorts of environment is suitable for this tree? Or even more broadly than that, I have this kind of area in my landscape. What would be a good tree to go here? So having that real person to talk to can be very important also. Along with that, you're going to be able to see that product before you make a purchase. So you can look at that tree, make sure it doesn't have any damage to it, make sure it's got the structure that you want for it. You're going to be able to just really make sure that you're getting a good product. Now, the only thing that we do need to think about if we're talking about shopping locally is that the world is a big place and the internet is a big place, and certainly you're going to find a lot more diversity of products online than you will at a local garden center. And really that can be a plus or a minus, because generally speaking, those nurseries are going to carry a product that's going to be suited for the area that you're living in. But sometimes we are looking for things that we can't find locally. That being said, if you do have a particular plant that you just need to have in your landscape, I again encourage you, go and speak to your local nursery person. Very likely, if they don't currently have it in stock, it's something that they're going to be able to order for you. And then again, you're going to have all of those advantages that we talked about for purchasing trees locally. Now, I did mention that, when you purchase a plant locally, you are going to be able to get a larger plant, but we do want to consider plant size when we're talking about purchasing a tree. A lot of times, certainly in my landscape, I am thrilled to get instant gratification and having that big plant right where I want it to be. But it's going to be a lot less expensive to purchase a small plant than it is going to be to get one of those larger container plants. So, if you need that instant gratification, if you have a space that absolutely needs to be filled, there is a justification for going with a larger plant. But generally speaking, those small container plants are going to grow quite rapidly after you put them in your landscape. And so you're going to see them grow into that location, and you can avoid that extra cost just by buying a slightly smaller plant. Now, you do want to make sure that you're buying a quality plant. There are a few things that you definitely want to look for when you're there at the nursery to make sure that you're getting a plant that's going to be in good shape. You want to make sure that you don't see any sign of insect damage or any sign of cold damage or diseases that are present on that plant. And you also want to make sure that you don't see any sign of mechanical damage. Sometimes as the plants get moved around, they may have something knock into them or break several of their branches. You want to make sure that you're getting a plant that's going to be in really good shape. Because how it's treated as, before you put it in the ground is certainly going to affect how well it grows once you get it in the ground. And you also want to make sure that you select trees that have the right branch structure. So having that good framework of strong branches early in the growth of that plant is really going to influence how well it does in the landscape later. So you want to look for plants that are, ideally at a time when they're going to have healthy green foliage, have that full canopy. You can ensure that they're leafing out all over their canopy. If you are purchasing it while it's dormant, and in a lot of cases, that's just what we're doing, but what we want to look for is a good branching structure. And you can see a picture there over in your top right that kind of shows you good quality versus poor quality. You want to have all of those branches less than about 2/3 the diameter of the trunk. Ideally with those branches they're going out at a good angle. And you don't want to see multiple uprights on a single tree. You really want to see, in the vast majority of trees, that single leader going all the way from the ground to the top. And that is going to produce a plant that really has that shape that we're looking for in the tree. Now, I do want to include a little note there that some trees, we prune them differently and we shape them differently and we expect different things out of them. So having that central leader, it's not universally true, but it is true the majority of the time. So another thing we really want to look for when we're looking at that branch angle, and you can see that down in the bottom picture there, is if they have a really narrow branch angle as opposed to a wider branch angle, they'll start to form what's called included bark there at the join of those two branches. And that winds up producing a really weak place on the plant later as the plant grows larger. And that can cause splitting or other problems as the plant ages. So starting with that good plant is really going to do a good job for us in making sure that we have a good plant later. Now, one thing that we commonly do encounter when we purchase plants that we really want to watch out for is looking and making sure that we do not have a plant that is root bound. You can see a pretty extreme example of this there in that picture. The roots are just circling the top of the plot pot, and as you pull that out of its container, you're going to see those roots just circling the entire pot all the way down. And that's really just a sign that that plant should have been moved up to a larger pot size to allow that root system to expand naturally. Now, once you get that in the ground, that root bound situation is just going to cause those roots to stay right there rather than branching out properly. So this is really something that we want to avoid when we're purchasing plants. I am in no way ashamed when I'm there at the nursery. Before I spend money on a plant, I'm going to pull that plant out of its container and take a look at its root system to make sure that I don't have a situation like this. Now, if you do have a plant that's mildly root bound, it is possible to address that. You can cut the roots and kind of free up those roots to allow them to expand. Though in a situation as bad as what you see in that picture, I don't know that we'd be able to rescue that. Now that we have our plants, we want to make sure that we're going to take good care of them before it's time to get them into the ground. Now, ideally, this is something that you want to prepare for before you actually go and purchase the plant. Know what you're going to go get, what kind of plant, know where you're going to put it, and ideally, if you can, already having that hole dug before you bring that plant home is going to be the ideal situation there. Now, often that's not the case. And I am absolutely guilty of this, where I have 10 or 12 trees sitting in pots in front of my house. So we can have a temporary holding area that we can use for the plant until that time for getting them in the ground is going to happen. Now, we do want to make sure that we are watering those plants. They're in containers. They're going to, particularly as the temperatures get warmer, we're really going to have to make sure that we're providing them the water that they need. And so, placing those plants in an area where it's going to be accessible to us, we're not going to have to, go buy a new hose in order to water them. And we're not going to have to carry buckets of water around. So you want to put it somewhere where you've got a spigot, can water really easily. And you also want to put it somewhere where you're going to go frequently. So it's really easy. You wouldn't think so, but it's really easy to forget that you have that plant sitting off in a corner somewhere. So put those trees somewhere where you know you're going to go. Check them on a daily basis to make sure that we've got good soil moisture. Ideally with some shade, that's just going to help them prevent some of that moisture loss and also protect them from the wind. It's very easy for them to get blown over. And that's not really good for them. You can actually just mulch around the base of the plants in the pot, and that's going to help you retain some moisture in that pot as well. Now we're going to get on to preparing our planting site. And the words I always use for this is if we've got a 50-cent plant, we want to make sure we put that in a $5 hole. We want to make sure we're giving that plant a good start by having that ideal planting spot for it. So what we want to aim for is, and I'm starting here talking about ball and burlap plants. I know that's not everything that we're going to be talking about, but we're going to start off with a planting hole that's going to be twice as wide as the ball or as the container when we're transplanting that in. And ideally, we want the edges of that hole to be dug at 45 degrees. We don't want that hole to be straight down. We want it to slope in at a 45-degree angle. And that's just going to allow those roots to expand really comfortably into that space. And particularly for us, in South Mississippi, we have really heavy clay a lot of the time. I'm from North Mississippi originally. I don't think it's that different there. Very often we're putting the plant into a fairly heavy clay soil, and as we dig that hole, it's really easy for us to just kind of make a big pot in the ground. So roughing up the edges or cutting grooves into the sides and bottom of that hole is going to break up the surface of that clay and make sure we're going to be able to get water movement and root movement through that surface. So we also, oftentimes I do get asked, Do I want to amend anything, or do I want to put different things into the soil as I am planting my tree? And in an ideal situation, I try to avoid adding any amendment into the soil other than just the native soil that's there. Generally speaking, that's going to be a lot better for the plant than adding any amendment as we go. Now, that newly planted tree is going to grow a really intensive root system. It's going to get mated into that good soil. So you want to make sure that it's fairly easy for it to penetrate into the heavier soils that you may have. If you've got a really heavy clay soil, you can amend that with a organic matter like pine bark or a leaf mold. But the trick here is not just modifying the soil that you put back into the hole that you've dug. You want to modify the soil in the area that plant is going to go. And so, adding bark 2 to 3 inches per 6-inch depth of a clay-like soil, that is something you can do, or 2 to 3 inches per 6-inch depth of a bark, an inch of peat moss, a 6-inch depth. All of that applies to the entire area that plant is going to occupy, not just the hole that you're digging. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the different ways that we can purchase plants and look at getting them in the ground. Starting off with ball and burlap plants. So this is probably not the most common way that a homeowner is going to purchase plants. Sometimes it does come up. But for ball and burlap plants, dig that planting hole no deeper than the height of the soil wall. We really want the depth of soil on that plant in the ground to be identical to the depth of the soil that it's in that ball or in the container we'll talk about in just a minute. If we dig that hole any deeper, that plant's going to settle down. It's going to wind up kind of being in a depression, and that can wind up damaging the roots and can cause water to settle into that depression. It's really bad for the plant in the long run. You're actually going to, if you look at the base of that plant, you're going to see some discoloration on the bark right at the ground level. That's going to tell you exactly where that soil level is, and that's what your target is. Another important thing that I see people doing pretty frequently is if we're moving plants around, whether they be in containers or in ball and burlap, we want to pick up the plant by the ball or by the container, not just by the trunk of the tree. It's really easy to damage them that way. We don't want to damage the root system or damage the trunk. And we're setting that ball right down into that planting site, filling the hole, trying not to disturb the root ball at all. So at that point, we're adding backfill 2/3 of the depth up the root ball, firm it, settle it in with water, and then we want to cut away those strings or metal. There's actually a lot of conversation as to whether it's better to remove that burlap or not. Sometimes it is actual burlap, which ideally will break down in the soil. If it is a synthetic material or if it's treated in any way, you do want to completely remove that from the root ball, because it's not going to break down properly. Otherwise, you can just remove the top of it. And you make sure particularly you may have some metal wire there, so be careful with that. You may not want that sticking up above ground, so a good idea to remove it. If it's firm enough, if it's going to remain intact, you remove the regular burlap also. Ideally that's going to break down in the soil, but practically speaking, a lot of times it just doesn't break down as fast as we would like it to be. We just want to make a 3 to 4 inch berm or raised area that's going to surround that root ball. And now we can talk a little bit about container plants. Really, we're going to deal with container plants just the same way as we're going to deal with a ball and burlap plant. Again, we're making that planting hole twice the diameter of the soil ball, no deeper than its height. And we want to make sure, again, you can see a couple examples here of plants that have a pretty, the one on the bottom at least is a good bit root bound. So we want to make sure we're separating that out, make a good 3 vertical cuts down the length of that root system, just to be able to tease those roots out, so they're going to be able to spread out well in the planting hole. Oftentimes you wind up with a mat of roots down at the bottom of the container, and generally it's just a good idea to cut all of those roots off from the bottom, because that matted root is just never going to be able to come apart. We do occasionally purchase bare root plants. I see this pretty frequently with people buying fruit trees. Oftentimes when you buy bare root plants, you're going to get them in a small bag that has some sort of material in there that is designed to keep those roots moist. So we want to not only take off that packing bag, we also want to make sure that we're removing any of that packing material away from the roots. We want to make sure that we check and we don't see any signs of disease or broken roots or dead roots. If we see anything that might be a problem, take a good clean pair of pruning shears and remove those before we put them in the ground. We also want to clip anything that's exceptionally long. So if one root is just much, much longer than all of the other roots, we can cut that back just to get a little bit more balance. And we then want to actually just put those roots down into a bucket of water, soak them for about an hour, make sure they have really good water content. Now, we are going to have to pay attention when we're making the hole for this bare root plant, because it doesn't have all that soil associated with it. So we're making those individual holes for bare root plant. We need it wide enough to spread those roots out, but we don't want it to be any deeper than the original soil depth on that plant. And again, you can look for that line on the trunk of that tree to make sure we know right where that soil depth should be. And we'll want to build up a crown right in the center of that hole, and that's going to give that plant a space where it's going to be able to sit on top of that without settling down into the ground. That mound, you can see that in that image where it's just allowing you to set that plant right on that mound and spread those roots evenly out through the planting hole before you backfill in the material for the hole. Now, it is very important to water newly transplanted trees. You want to thoroughly water them, particularly immediately after you plant. Water is very important during that first growing season, and lack of water really is the leading cause of problems with transplanted trees. If you water them properly, you're going to have a much better chance of success. And I mentioned briefly when I was talking about ball and burlap plants that we wanted to create a berm around the root ball of that plant. You can see an image of it there where you've just made a little moat that water can sit in and can percolate down and get right to where that root system is. And now once that tree is established, you can remove that berm and let water flow naturally, but just making sure that you're getting that water right down to the root system of that plant is very, very important. Once you have the plant a little bit more established, having mulch there is very important for young shrubs. And a large part of that is just in water conservation. So the mulch being right there on top of the soil is just going to slow water loss from the soil. The other really important thing it's going to do is to reduce competition from weeds and even competition from grass. If you're planting into an area in your lawn, whatever other plants are around that tree are trying to draw up the same nutrients that your newly transplanted tree wants. And so, removing that, eliminating any grass or any weeds that are around that tree is going to really help it succeed. The other thing that it does, and another really frequent cause of problems with newly transplanted trees, is what I like to call weed eater disease, though we generally refer to it as damage from maintenance equipment. So, the bark on that new tree is going to be very fragile. And so having that mulch around it not only means you don't have to use a weed eater or what have you to remove weeds, so it's going to prevent you from having to weed eat, but it's also going to be a really good marker that says, hey, this is an area where I want to be really careful and make sure that I'm not damaging this tree. So you can add 2 inches of bark or 6 inches of pine straw around that new tree, and that's going to give you all the effect you need in terms of controlling weeds, as well as holding that moisture there into the soil. Now, we do want to make sure that we're applying our mulch in a proper way, and as I drive around, oftentimes I do run into a lot of what I call mulch volcanoes, where mulch is just piled up onto the tree. And this can cause all sorts of issues with the bark and the vascular tissue, the energy and water transporting cells of those plants can be damaged by having that mulch piled up. So we don't want a mulch volcano. We want a kind of a donut or a shape around the tree. You can see that flare at the base of the trunk, and just mulching, with a thinner layer of mulch there, expanding outward, is going to be a much healthier condition for that tree to be in. I do frequently get asked about staking or guying trees, and my first comment on staking or guying is, unless you absolutely have to put in a stake, you shouldn't. So the ideal situation is not to apply a stake or a guy at all. But sometimes we're in a windy area, or we have a tree that just is having some difficulties, and it's necessary to do that. So guy wires are just supporting a really slender tree. It's protecting it from wind damage. The main thing that we want to do is, if we're going to have to stake or guy them, we want to make sure that we're doing it properly to actually protect the tree. And once the tree is capable of standing up to those conditions of itself, we want to make sure that we go ahead and remove them. We don't want to keep them on there any longer than necessary. So we do want to set those staking posts in line with the tree trunk. And generally what you're looking for is the prevailing wind. So if your prevailing winds are going north-south, you want to make sure that your stakes and your guy wires are actually preventing that movement in the wind. So make sure you arrange your stakes in the right direction. You also want to make sure that you put them far enough away from the plant that the plant can't hit the stake. Because you might cause damage to the tree trunk by just the tree trunk hitting that stake over and over again. Use a broad bandage or run the wire through a piece of rubber hose. That's going to keep the wire from rubbing against the bark and causing damage. And really, just as put that stake as high enough to hold it upright in calm weather. You're still going to see some movement of the tree when you have high winds, and you want to make sure that that tree, once those windy conditions are over, returns to its vertical position. So you don't want to see it continuing to lean after you have those winds go away. Now, a few important notes here: what trees should you plant? And I'm not going to, start listing all the trees that I think are great. I think a lot of them are wonderful. But there are some things that we want to consider, particularly when we're talking about planting trees in the home landscape. And one of the most important rules is that you want to fit the tree to the site, not try to fit the site to the tree. So it's going to be a lot easier to get a plant that's going to be suitable for the environment that you're putting it in, rather than trying to change that environment to fit a particular tree. And there's a lot of things we want to consider when we talk about that. And first of all, one of the things we want to think about is what function is that tree going to serve in our landscape? Is it there to provide just an attractive accent? Are we using it as a screen to not see a road or not see our neighbor? Are we using it for shade? Because different trees are going to perform differently and just, might be better suited to a particular job in the landscape. It is incredibly important to know how big that tree is going to get in your home landscape. I have a loropetalum out front that is 15 feet tall. A lot of people trim those down to shrub, but its potential mature height is quite large. Choosing a plant that's going to get too big is a really common mistake. And sometimes that canopy may be really narrow, but as it's going to, as that tree is going to get larger, it's going to spread out really significantly. So it's a really good idea, if you're thinking about a particular tree, either look at some examples that you can see in other people's landscapes, look at pictures, because you don't want to plant a tree that's just going to grow, overgrow the landscape area where you're putting it. You also do want to keep in mind, utility wires. I was out in Bay St. Louis today, and the crews are out there making sure they're cutting trees so that they're not interfering with utility lines. And sometimes that can really damage the appearance of a tree. Of course, the picture there on the bottom right is, I think, my favorite picture in this presentation, just because it really looks like that tree is trying to eat the power lines. So make sure that you're not planting a tree that's going to overgrow. It can cause a hazard as well as just an unattractive situation in the landscape. You also want to make sure that we pay attention to light conditions that are going to be available for the tree. That can be really important to ensure that we're going to have a healthy tree. So, if it says it's going to thrive in full sun, it really does need that 6 to 8 hours of direct sunlight. Full shade is going to be a plant that really likes it to be in the shade all the time, whether that be because of trees or other structures. Filtered shade might be a thin canopy of trees. Part sun can get direct sunlight for at least half the day. But understanding the environment, the area that you're going to be putting that tree into, and whether it's going to thrive in that situation in terms of its light conditions is really important. Of course, we also want to talk about soil conditions. We want to make sure that we have all the right nutrition there in the soil, have the correct pH for that tree. And of course, the absolute best way to do that is to do a soil test. Most of our plants are going to be favoring a slightly acidic pH. There are a few fairly rare plants that like slightly more alkaline soils. I'm not going to talk extensively about soil testing. I'm just going to refer you to go and look at the great video that Ross put down talking specifically about fertilization, because he really goes into some great detail about soil testing and all the things that you want to consider when you do that. Now, we do want to talk about soil drainage. Some plants are going to favor dry areas or wet areas, and we want to make sure that the water in the area where we're planting is going to percolate well enough. If it doesn't percolate well, we want to make sure that we plant something that's going to be able to tolerate that wetter condition. So we want to choose a day when the soil isn't excessively wet. If it rains, I usually wait a full day after it having rained, or possibly 2 days in order to do this. And I get an old-fashioned coffee can, if you can get one these days, a big 46-ounce can, and dig a 4-inch deep hole, and just set that can down into the floor of that hole. Firm the soil around the bottom so that water can't come around the bottom of it, and I fill the can to the top with water and wait an hour and see how that water is percolating down in my soil. If it drops 2 inches in an hour, then we've got pretty normal drainage. We're not doing too bad. If we come back and there's no water, then either we didn't put the coffee can in very good and the water went off the sides, or we just have a soil that water is just running through really quick. If we come back and the water hasn't moved at all, then we have a soil where we're just not getting a lot of percolation. We just need to understand what our drainage situation is so that we can react to that. Now, there are several different ways that we can address that drainage. Installation of French drains is something that I run into fairly frequently, and that really is just essentially putting a drain underneath the ground that's going to allow that water to hit that drain and be directed elsewhere, and really just move a lot of that water. Often we use raised beds, and raised beds absolutely can be used for planting trees. We want to make sure that we're really getting at least 12 inches deep on this. And a lot of times we'll also see trees planted in a raised berm. And that's, again, just raising up that soil level to help us get away from some of those drainage issues. Another thing we do want to consider as homeowners is whether having that tree in the landscape could cause some potential risk. One thing to think about, will it attract stinging insects? Does it have a messy fruit that's going to land on a sidewalk or something like that? Is it going to have a fruit that doesn't smell good? Is a possibility. Is it going to have thorns and spines or prickles, leaves, sharply pointed, things like a holly? Is that tree something that is potentially toxic to children or pets? Is it something that people can have a potential allergic reaction to? How aggressive is its growth? All of these are things that we want to consider. And just because a plant might fit one of these criteria, I love hollies. I have them here in my home landscape, and certainly they do have spines on the leaves. I have a number of trees that I really enjoy that do have thorns. It doesn't mean that you necessarily don't want to have that plant in your landscape. You just want to keep that in mind for where you're going to put that tree and what use you're going to have for it. And of course, I do encourage people, broadly speaking, using native plants has a lot of advantages. You're using them just like you would any other ornamental garden plant. And they tend to be a little bit lower maintenance. They tend to be really favorable for our local wildlife. And I just want to include a note, there's absolutely nothing wrong with having trees in your home landscape that aren't native. There are a lot of non-native trees that are wonderful for landscapes here and do a great job as shade trees or as accent trees. And incorporating them is great, but having that diversity of trees and having some of these native trees in your landscape really can add a lot to what you're doing. And of course, there is a long list of native trees in Mississippi. You can find this whole list in a publication on our website, which is Native Trees for Mississippi Landscapes. We also have a Native Shrubs for Mississippi Landscapes that you can find at extension.msstate.edu as really good resources to find plants that are going to be suitable for your particular landscape. And I just like to put in some pictures, show you some native plants doing a really good job in different landscapes to show that that these trees can be very effective. Of course, my one of my personal favorites is that red maple. I just think that color in the fall is wonderful. Of course, the southern magnolia is a fantastic landscape tree. They're blooming right now, and they just have an embarrassment of blooms. They have a really nice smell to them. As I said, I really enjoy hollies and oaks. A lot of options in the native trees that we have to work with. So I appreciate you being a part of this and listening to me. As we normally do, I'm going to